In December of 1867, a trade ship known as the Queen of Swansea was traveling along the Newfoundland coast when it disappeared during a violent storm and was presumed lost at sea. However, months later, on a desolate island nearby, a group of sailors stumbled upon something that changed the story entirely. What they found revealed a far more disturbing series of events than anyone could have imagined. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. On April 21st, 1868, a small schooner was returning from a sealing voyage along the Newfoundland coast. The season had been long and cold, and the crew was ready to get home, but as they passed near Gull Island, they noticed some seabirds circling low over it. Seeing this as an opportunity, a small boat was launched from the schooner with a few sailors aboard. When they got close enough to the island, one of the men took a shot at the birds. As the crack of the gun echoed, one of the birds went limp and fell from the sky onto the island. The small boat then made its way toward the shore so the sailors could retrieve the fallen bird. They expected nothing more than a quick landing and a short walk to collect the animal. Gull Island was known as a desolate place, little more than a rocky strip off Cape St. John. Ships didn't stop there unless something was wrong. In fact, no one inhabited Gull Island or even visited for that matter. It's a barren outcrop that's almost completely devoid of boat-friendly access points. Fortunately for the sailors, retrieving the bird meant only walking a handful of feet onto the island before they'd return to the sealing schooner. After making a fast, bumpy landfall, the sailors climbed out of their small boat and began to search for the bird one of them shot, but almost immediately something else on the island caught their attention. All at once, they stopped, but no one bent down to pick up the bird. The men stood there for a moment, looking at something that clearly did not belong on an uninhabited island. When they were finally able to break their gaze from what was lying at their feet, they started to look around and spotted a piece of torn canvas. After cautiously approaching it, one of the men lifted up a corner of what appeared to be a tattered sail and discovered something absolutely horrifying underneath it. The situation was serious enough that they turned back to their small boat immediately without speaking much about what they had just seen. A few moments later, the small boat was pushed off the rock and rowed straight back to the schooner. When they climbed aboard and reported what they had seen, the mood among the sailors on deck changed. What had been a lighthearted return journey home had suddenly become something much different. The captain of the schooner, Mark Russell, decided to go ashore himself and have a look. He wasn't willing to rely on secondhand stories, and if something unusual was on Gull Island, he intended to see it with his own eyes. However, once he did, he didn't hang around the island long either. Mark returned to the schooner with no hesitation. Back aboard, he quickly gave orders for the vessel to head to nearby Tilt Cove at once. Word needed to be spread and help was required for what would come next. Shortly after the schooner reached the community, the news that something had been found on Gull Island reached far and wide. For months up to this point, a mystery had confounded the communities up and down the Newfoundland coast, and based on the word from the crew of the schooner, the answers seemed to be lying on Gull Island. To understand what the sailors stumbled upon that morning, though, we have to rewind several months to the beginning. The Queen of Swansea wasn't some massive ocean liner that was pushing the envelope. Rather, it was a 360-ton brigantine ship that was built solid for steady work. In the simplest terms, a brigantine in the 19th century was a two-masted sailing ship that was larger than some of the more popular designs at the time. It was the kind of ship commonly used in coastal and transatlantic trade during the era, known to be reliable and efficient as a cargo vessel. The Queen of Swansea was built in New Harbour in Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, but it operated out of Swansea, Wales, and traded across the Atlantic Ocean. Its crew was largely made up of experienced Cornish sailors accustomed to the harsh weather and seas of the North Atlantic. Its captain, John Owens, was also a Welshman, and by reputation, the Queen of Swansea was considered a good ship. In December of 1967, the vessel had a fairly straightforward job. It would leave St. John's and sail north along the Newfoundland coast to Tilt Cove in Notre Dame Bay, a distance of roughly 200 miles or about 322 kilometers. In good weather and favorable conditions, it was not an especially long or complicated run. The ship carried timber, mail, and a small group of passengers tied to the mining operations at Tilt Cove. Once there, it was expected to unload and then take on a fresh cargo of ore for a return voyage to England. And Tilt Cove was a busy place by the standards of the time. The mine there produced copper and nickel, and the settlement had grown quickly around that industry in recent years. Ships like the Queen of Swansea were a lifeline for the community, bringing supplies and taking away the resources that fueled the operation. Among the passengers on board was Dr. Felix Dowsley, a pharmacist from St. John's who had been hired by the mining company to provide medical services during the winter months. In that era, pharmacists often filled the role of physician, especially in remote communities, so it wasn't unusual for someone of his background to serve as a primary medical provider. Also aboard were William Hoskins and his sister Grenelda. They were the adult children of the Tilt Cove's mine manager, and like Felix, they were headed to Tilt Cove for business. The voyage there was meant to be a short one, lasting just a few days, and getting those aboard into the mining community well before Christmas. In total, 15 people were on board between the crew and passengers, and all of them were expecting a routine journey that would be inconvenient at its worst. Winter travel around Newfoundland was never comfortable, but it was certainly not out of the question. However, little did they know what awaited them at the time. On December 5th, 1867, the Queen of Swansea left St. John's and turned north toward Tilt Cove, and while the weather looked unsettled, no one considered it reason enough to delay their departure. Just hours after leaving port, however, night fell, and so did rain and snow. A gale struck with incredible force, pushing the ship farther out than intended. Reports suggest that the ship may have been pushed out more than 160 miles or 257 kilometers off course, maybe even further. Whatever the exact distance though, it was enough to pull them into open water and away from the relative shelter of the coastline. The storm did not pass quickly either. For nearly 3 days, the vessel battled heavy seas as it pitched and rolled in the darkness. Those on board endured constant motion, cold spray, and little rest. Sleep was brief and tense, and meals, if taken at all, were likely hurried and uncomfortable to say the least. So despite the rosy outlook at the beginning of the voyage, the passengers and crew couldn't help but wonder if the next massive wave to hit them would be the one that would overwhelm the ship. The Queen of Swansea held together though in the rough seas, and the crew worked to manage the sails and keep the vessel steady. The passengers could do little but wait and trust the experience of the men in charge of keeping the ship afloat. And by the time the worst of the gale subsided, everyone on board had been tested. By then, they had been at sea for days longer than expected and in far worse conditions than anticipated. When the weather finally subsided, the ship made its way back toward land and righted its course. It took 7 days in total before they reached the entrance to Notre Dame Bay early on the morning of December 12th, and it seemed like the worst was behind them. Right around midnight, John made the decision to keep the ship in place until daylight, which would give the crew a much better view of the scattered islands and rocky hazards that littered the area. The sea was finally calmer and the weather was much more favorable to sailing, and there was little reason to rush into Tilt Cove. At some point during the night, however, the ship's pilot decided to bring the Queen of Swansea into port. He believed he knew the course well enough and that their destination was close enough. After almost a week of delays, the thought of stopping again must have been difficult to accept, so the vessel began its course through the bay. As the ship made its final push toward land, a snowstorm came out of nowhere and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The sea grew rough again and waves began overwhelming the ship. The crew strained to make out familiar landmarks, particularly Cape St. John, which would have helped guide them safely toward Tilt Cove. The storm then closed in around them and snow filled the air more and more. Quickly, the shoreline disappeared behind a wall of white. As the crew fought against this second storm, the passengers were up early and dressed in preparation to make landfall. It was approaching 6 o'clock in the morning and they expected to dock within an hour, as only about 12 miles or 19 kilometers stood between them and Tilt Cove. It was a short stretch by comparison to what they had already endured, but they had no idea that directly in their path was Gull Island. In good conditions, it could have been easily avoided, but in a blinding snow squall, it was nearly invisible. Right as the clock struck 6 a.m., the Queen of Swansea struck Gull Island, and the impact was sudden and violent. The brigantine ran aground in one of the few spots where a landing was even possible on the island. Only a portion of the keel was caught in the rock, but that was enough to keep in place for the time being. Water began rushing into the ship immediately, and the sound of it told everyone aboard what they needed to know. The ship was badly damaged, and it would most certainly not be taking them to Tilt Cove anytime soon. The crew then acted fast, and one sailor managed to scramble onto the rock and secure a line. A rope was then passed between the ship and shore, and one by one, the passengers were pulled across onto firm land. It was cold and frantic as the storm blew all around them, but all 15 aboard made it onto Gull Island. The Queen of Swansea, meanwhile, clung to the rocks as waves continued to pound against its hull. This is when the group realized they had no supplies with them if they were forced into any kind of prolonged ordeal. With this, 3 of the crewmen and 1 passenger returned to the ship to get food, clothing, and anything else that might help them survive long enough to be rescued. They managed to grab a spare sail and transported it onto the island before returning for more supplies, and for a brief time it looked like the vessel might hold onto the rocks. Within moments of the return to the ship though, the lines tying the Queen of Swansea to Gull Island gave way. A strong wave tore the brigantine free from the rock and carried it back into the sea. It then drifted out of reach and disappeared into the storm, and the 4 men still aboard were lost with it. 15 minutes after the initial impact, the Queen of Swansea was gone, stranding 11 people on Gull Island. As was sort of already mentioned, Gull Island is not the kind of place you'd want to spend much time. It's a quarter-mile stretch of exposed rock and sheer cliffs that rise hundreds of feet above the sea. There were no trees, buildings, or natural shelter beyond the uneven stone all around them. Snow had piled across the frozen ground, and December winds continued to sweep across the island without obstruction. Because of their quick escape and the inability to get anything beyond the spare sail before the ship broke free, the survivors had little with them. They were wet from sea spray and snow, and many were only partially clothed for the conditions. They attempted to use the piece of sailcloth as a cover against the wind, but it wasn't nearly enough to protect them from the cold winter conditions. When the storm finally passed and conditions cleared, to their surprise, the mainland was actually visible from the island. The community of Shoe Cove sat only a few miles away, and with visibility now back to normal, the castaways could actually see smoke rising from chimneys and boats moving in the bay as fishermen went about their work. In the early going, hopes were high that they would be spotted and rescued rather quickly, but horrifyingly, that's just not what happened. With no food or water, hunger and thirst began almost right away. Snow could be gathered and melted in their mouths, but it offered little relief and sapped their body heat. Since Gull Island was literally without vegetation, there was no wood to build a fire and no food to gather. Even the grass, what little there was to be found, was sparse and withered. They used it to try to start a fire, but there wasn't nearly enough to burn to maintain it. Their second day on the island brought another storm. This one buried the island on fresh snow and drove temperatures even lower. Visibility vanished again, and whatever hope they held onto that someone might notice them that day faded with the clear weather. By the time that storm finished, some of the castaways were already weakened from a lack of sustenance. Just standing upright was difficult, and the realization began to set in that their proximity to civilization did not guarantee rescue. They were close enough to see houses across the bay, but they were cut off by the water and the weather. All they could do was wait, conserve what strength they had left, hope that by some chance they'd be seen, and as it turned out, right. While the 11 stranded people had almost nothing, they did have paper and writing utensils. Among the few items saved from the wreck were the ship's papers and a logbook, both protected in a tin case. In the middle of the panic of the wreck, someone thought to preserve the documentation. 3 of the castaways would sit down and pen various writings during the ordeal, one of them being Captain John. His notes were what you might expect from a captain, full of dates, conditions, and straightforward facts. He recorded what happened without much commentary or emotion, and his words read like entries in a ledger, as though he was still doing his duty in the face of so much suffering. Dr. Felix, by contrast, wrote entirely differently. Instead of simply reporting what the castaways were going through, he wrote letters to his wife, Margaret, who was awaiting his arrival in St. John's. His writings were deeply personal and intimate, and overwhelmingly desperate from the start. In one of his early letters, dated December 16th, he described the island and their circumstances plainly. They were sleeping on bare rock beneath the piece of dirty sailcloth from the wreck. Their clothing was soaked and freezing. He complained of great pain in his feet and said that they were swollen to the point where he was struggling to walk, likely from cold exposure and lack of proper footwear. He admitted that his strength was failing, that there wasn't a morsel of food to be found anywhere, and there was no source of fresh water other than the snow gathered from the ground. Felix warned that if help did not arrive soon, some of them would die, and that he believed he might be among the first to go. He also acknowledged something far darker. If he died before rescue came, he told Margaret that she would not receive a body to bury. The other castaways would need it more than she would. Just 4 days into their ordeal, his words revealed that desperate, starving thoughts were already rattling around the heads of the stranded. On day 6, Felix wrote again. He mentioned that all the castaways were still alive at this point, but his tone had become even more discouraged. In this much shorter entry, he described lying down beneath the sailcloth, too weak to do anything other than wait to pass. Then on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Felix wrote for the final time. He stated again that they were all still alive, but there was no sign of any relief in sight. By then, if his account was accurate, the group had survived 13 days without food and had only consumed water by eating the dirty snow that had gathered around their feet. His feet were also in constant pain by then, and he was exhausted beyond all comprehension. At some point while writing this letter, he ran out of ink, so he finished it with his own blood. William also left behind accounts of the ordeal on Gull Island, but unfortunately, they were reported lost not long after being recovered. What remains of his account comes from newspaper reports at the time, and according to those reports, the group discussed drawing lots to determine who might be sacrificed so the others could survive. No one volunteered, as you might imagine, so a method was chosen and names were drawn. William's sister Grenelda was said to have drawn the lot, but William reportedly offered to take her place. Felix's letters make no direct reference to a sacrifice taking place. He also didn't confirm whether William followed through on his offer or whether anyone was killed intentionally. What he does leave behind, though, is a cryptic line suggesting that the full truth of what happened on the island was way worse than what he had written. If anything like a sacrifice did take place, it's possible that Felix omitted that information from his letters to spare his wife any further horror. Newspaper coverage at the time did not hesitate to speculate, though, and rumors followed the story of the Queen of Swansea castaways to this day. What is certain is that by the time rescue came in the form of Mark's sealing schooner in April of 1868, the 11 stranded shipwreck survivors were already long dead. When Captain Mark returned to Gull Island with these 60 men to retrieve the Queen of Swansea dead, the work was nothing short of grim. The bodies had endured months of winter exposure, and the snow and freezing temperatures had preserved them in place. 9 of the bodies were found beneath the torn sailcloth that had once served as the group's shelter. 2 others were discovered completely skeletonized, separate from the group, and were the first bodies found by Mark's crew when they went searching for the bird they had shot. According to some reports, those bodies showed signs of flesh having been removed, further fueling speculation. Separating the remains afterward from one another actually required crowbars, but the men did what they could to treat them with respect under the difficult circumstances. They were then carried back to Tilt Cove, and all but one were buried quickly. Felix's letter had made his wishes clear, and his remains were transported to St. John's and buried in Belvedere Cemetery as he had asked. The discovery of the bodies brought with it answers to a mystery that had lasted several long months. Shortly after the Queen of Swansea failed to show up at Tilt Cove when expected, rumors began to circulate that the ship was lost in the storm it encountered and it sank. No one could have imagined that for a precious few weeks, the surviving passengers and crew of the ship were clinging to life just on the other side of the bay. Even with all of this, though, questions still remain. We don't know how long beyond Christmas Eve the last of them lived, nor do we know whether a sacrifice was carried out or if it was merely discussed. We also don't know who was the first or last to die. In the end, all that is known is that they passed within sight of salvation. One of the other more persistent questions involved the nearby community of Shoe Cove. Some later accounts claim that the citizens there had seen lights or flames on the island during the days after the wreck. Those claims led to an unthinkable conclusion. If fires had been seen, why had no one gone to investigate? According to some versions of the story, villagers believed the lights were something known locally as Jack the Lantern. In regional folklore, mysterious lights seen in lonely places at night were sometimes viewed as bad omens or wandering spirits. The idea that such lights might signal danger might have kept some people away from determining what they were. Because of that belief, the story supposes that the people of Shoe Cove ignored what might have been distress signals. With that said, though, this isn't supported by the writings left behind on the island. Both John and Felix stated plainly that the castaways were unable to maintain a real fire. The island had no wood, and the small tufts of grass they burned early on with their matches would have produced only small, brief flames. There's also another important detail to consider. In those days, fishermen rarely went to sea after November. Winter storms and ice made sea travel dangerous, so small communities tended to stay close to shore during the winter months. There were, of course, exceptions, and some of the writings found on Gull Island indicated that the castaways had spotted passing ships that failed to spot them back. Even if this were the case, though, it's entirely possible that even if someone had seen something unusual on the island, they would not have attempted a trip across winter seas without a clear understanding of what might be happening. Again, the assumption at the time was that the Queen of Swansea was sunk at sea, with all of its passengers and crewmen going down with the ship, so no one was looking for them. Still, though, as you might imagine, the tragedy left people searching for something or someone to blame. When an inquiry was eventually held, it concluded that the wreck itself was an act of God. The storm, poor visibility, and the hidden rocks of Gull Island had combined in a way that doomed the ship. But interestingly, the inquiry did not entirely absolve the nearby communities of some responsibility. The official conclusion suggested that ignorance and superstition may have played a role in preventing the castaways from being discovered while they were still alive. Whether that criticism is fair or not is still debated to this day. In 1884, 17 years after the wreck, a lighthouse was finally constructed there. The island had already claimed 1 ship and 11 lives after the wreck itself, and the lighthouse was meant to ensure that no other vessel would meet the same fate by striking the rocks in the darkness or poor weather. The first man appointed to serve as the lighthouse keeper was none other than Captain Mark. All the castaways, with the exception of Felix, are buried together in Tilt Cove, and a large monument was installed at the gravesite in remembrance of all they endured and how close they came to surviving their terrifying ordeal. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.